Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The Wall Street Blockchain Alliance is very proud to offer our latest webinar, Navigating Crypto and Payments Law, State-by-State Insights. My name is Ron Quaranta, Chair of the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance. It's a privilege to moderate my colleagues and panelists. Before we begin, a bit of housekeeping for today's session. Please keep in mind this event's offered for general information and educational purposes only, not intended to constitute any kind of accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice. And obviously, any of the views or opinions expressed during the event of those of the participants don't necessarily reflect the views of the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance or our participants' firms. Please keep in mind this webinar is being recorded. All attendees will be in listen-only mode. And everyone's encouraged to really submit questions for our colleagues and panelists using the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll reserve time at the end of the session for that audience Q&A. So with that, let us kick off. Michelle Gitlitz, Joe Sicolo, it is good to see you both. We've got a lot to cover, and this will be kind of a recurring for us. Michelle, you and I have talked about this often, but I do want to give you the opportunity to introduce yourselves to our colleagues and friends who are watching the webinar. Michelle, tell everyone who you are and what you do, and tell us about change agents.
Thanks so much, Ron. Appreciate being here. Appreciate everybody joining and always collaborating with WSBA and Joe. Michelle Gitlitz. I've been a lawyer in the financial services ecosystem for over 20 years. I've been in crypto since 2015, and in particular, payments in crypto, and just coming out of stealth mode with a company called Change Agents Technologies, Inc. We are a new emerging company. We are creating and have created a compliance and risk management platform. Our first workflow are U.S. money transmitter license acquisition and maintenance. We are working on additional workflows, and what we are really trying to accomplish is to bridge the gap between sort of old school antiquated compliance systems and new and innovative ways to use and access data. So for example, we help auto-populate money transmitter license applications and maintenance forms, but we're also working on is that data sits latent on your systems or in whatever system you're using. How can we use that data and analyze it to help you with your reporting, with your exam preparation, with your independent audits, with your accounting functionalities? And so it's a collaborative tool. We are actively looking for design partners and collaborators. So if you are having a compliance issue, we really want to hear about it because we're trying to solve some of that friction. I'm also of counsel at Arcturus PLLC, where I do legal and advisory work.
You literally do have at least 2 full-time jobs. Michelle, it's great to see you. You've been a member of the WSBA for a long time. Looking forward to our discussion. Joe, I'm happy that we got reconnected. And as I was joking with you and I, Michelle, when we did prep, you and I first chatted, I think it was 2014 or 2015, and I can't believe almost a decade's gone by. Joe, introduce yourself to the audience, please. Tell them about ItBitAML, and let's take it from there.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ron. It has been pretty close to 10 years or 100 years in Bitcoin years, but great to reconnect with you and your members. So yeah, everybody, folks I haven't met, my name is Joe Chicolo. I'm the founder of a company called BitAML, and we provide regulatory compliance consulting services to the crypto space, and have done so for almost 10 years now, beginning May 2015. Hard to believe it's been that long. In that time, we've worked with hundreds of clients, big and small, working on AML compliance documentation, independent reviews, training, cybersecurity consulting, and other areas of the risk management spectrum, again, all within the crypto ecosystem. Before I got into crypto, I was in traditional bank compliance, helping out with AML and fraud prevention at various larger bank institutions here in the States. I also wear another hat. I'm the president of the California Blockchain Advocacy Coalition, or CBAC. We are a 501c6 trade association representing the interests of the crypto and blockchain community before the California legislature, the California governor's office, and various state regulatory agencies, representing companies big and small across the crypto ecosystem, including Block, Kraken, Coinbase, CoinFlip, and various other companies, again, big and small, at the state level here in California.
Joe, good to have you with us. Let's start the conversation. Michelle, many months ago, you and I were chatting. You're a member of our legal working group. We talked about payments and the importance of focusing on payments. And that conversation evolved into there's a lot of focus on the federal, but not enough potentially on the states. And that kind of brought the genesis of the conversation we're having here, which will potentially be a regular recurring conversation. But Joe, from your perch in California, let me start with you. You know, the three of us have been in crypto long enough to remember that if you went to a legislator at any level, federal, state, or local, and brought up crypto, you arguably got thrown out of the room. It's a very different conversation now. Joe, how have you seen that evolution of influence from crypto companies? And everyone's been talking about super PACs at the federal level, getting involved in the federal elections, but how have you seen government relations evolve for crypto companies from your position?
Sure. I think we could spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the recent election in DC, and I think our focus here is at the state level, and we've seen a very strong maturation among crypto companies in building out their government affairs and government touch points within their organizations, having folks that are seasoned and well-versed in understanding legislation, regulatory outreach, and engaging in the conversation, and having a seat at the table. We're fond of saying that in politics, if you don't have a seat at the table, you're on the menu. And I think that holds true in any industry, but especially in crypto. And like I said, we've seen crypto companies step up and say, hey, we want to be part of the solution. We want to demystify crypto. We want to engage with lawmakers, help them understand where we're coming from. It's not asking for any preferential treatment, but really focusing on, hey, how can we demystify some of the misinformation that's out there? And how can we engage in substantive discussions and say, hey, we want to, and we have demonstrated that we could work with law enforcement, that we can work with regulators to understand the nuances of technical definitions, and really educate folks in the public policy space who, understandably, they have to be generalists. They have to be, they're expected to be, unnecessarily, I might add, they're expected to be experts in things like healthcare, infrastructure, and let's add crypto to that. So they have to learn a bevy of different subjects. And it's up to us as an industry to professionally and thoughtfully present ourselves, what we're working on, and ultimately come to a professional discussion about how that moves forward in terms of legislation, public policy, and regulation.
Joe, thanks so much. Michelle, weigh in on this. And I'd love you and Joe to give us some perspective on, you know, what have been those challenges and opportunities when we look at these conversations? And again, we're talking about this, let's talk about the state level. Joe, you referenced the education component. And again, you know, we've often joked in the past about, well, you know, legislators believing crypto and Bitcoin particularly are only for sanctions evasion or tax evasion. And I remember so many colleagues saying, if that's a criminal's idea of evading, it's just about the dumbest way to possibly evade investigation. But Michelle, back to you, like, what are those challenges and opportunities, and why are state conversations so important at this point?
Yeah, I think you know, it goes back to our dual banking system. We have federal banking regimes, and we also have state banking and payment regimes. And in the payment space, and when I talk about payments, I'm really talking about money transmission. And what is money transmission? That is, you are, or the company is, or the person is receiving value from person A and transmitting that value to person B, or person A at a different location. And what do I mean by person A at a different location? I mean, I'm taking Ron's fiat and I'm converting it to crypto, and then I'm remitting, excuse me, Ron's crypto to his Coinbase account. So you can be working with the same person, but still be engaging in money transmission. And so the states have always been the primary regulator of that activity. Yes, if you are a money transmitter, you are under FinCEN guidance, a money services business, which is a type of financial institution. And you have to, unless you have an exemption, you have to register with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network and have anti-money laundering, know your customer policies and procedures, and perform sanction screening. But that's just a registration and compliance regime. If you want to service customers in every state, like if you're Venmo, if you're Coinbase, if you're X, formerly known as Twitter, getting your payments licenses, you need to go state by state, except for Montana, and they don't have any money transmitter regulations. But if you want to service those customers in those states, you need to have a license or an exemption. Why each state? Because the state laws come from the sale of checks, when we all used to write paper checks. And they came from the advent of your Western Unions and your MoneyGrams and your money transmitters. The state, for example, of New Jersey is concerned if Ron is using one of these platforms, or the state of California is concerned if Joe is using one of these platforms, that Joe gives his money to that company and his money gets to the recipient. And if the money doesn't get to the recipient, the person, Joe or Ron, can call up their state regulator and say, hey, my funds are missing. They didn't get to the destination. So it's anti-money laundering, know your customer, but it's also very, very strong consumer protection obligations. And so the states are important because the states actually came out, at least some of them, with some guidance about crypto transactions after we received guidance from FinCEN, but in particular with respect to transmission and remittances.
Joe, I have to confess, I'm a little concerned that Michelle keeps using you and I as the example of people trying to transmit money and things are going haywire. Michelle, let me stay with you for a minute because, we understand this when we have this conversation, that lack of uniformity in rules and regulations across all of the states. When we look at folks starting new businesses, when we look at, market participants broadly, why that lack of uniformity, and why, how do you direct people? I'm skipping a little bit ahead here. How do you direct firms or clients when they say, I want to do business in all 50 states, for example? And the answer is maybe not. So why that lack of uniformity? And I have to rip up the script a little bit, Michelle. What put you on that path of understanding state payments regulations?
So I guess I'll take the second question first. Maybe I'm just a glutton for punishment, but I see some of our attendees who are my fellow payment state practitioners who are also gluttons for punishment, I think. Truthfully, I was a securities and financial services lawyer, and when I got into crypto in 2015 and really dug in deep in 16 and 17, there was no guidance around token offerings and what was a security. Ironically, we still don't have a lot of that guidance, although maybe things will change. But I really like to practice and give guidance in areas where there are rules. And I also thought, well, there's all these tokens, and I don't think people are just going to want to invest with them. I think people are going to want to transact with them, whether that be exchanging one token for another token or paying with a token. And so I looked at the payments rules. I've been doing some payments work, and I thought, well, okay, FinCEN is giving us some really nice guidance since 2013 and 14, and then later in 2019. And even the states were giving guidance saying, we don't believe that crypto is money, so it doesn't fall within our money transmitter laws, or we believe that it's monetary value, and so it does fall within our payments laws, or it falls within our payments laws only if fiat's involved, but if it's crypto to crypto, we don't care yet. So I thought, well, maybe this is an opportunity to create an expertise in that state framework. And to answer your first question, the states regulate a lot of everyday activities. I think we just had an election where there were a lot of measures in different states on ballots. Crypto is just one. Crypto and money and payments transactions are just one of those things that states regulate.
I feel like we can go down a UCC conversation path at some future as well, Michelle. Thank you so much. Joe, weigh in on this a little bit. Give us your evolution. And let me skip ahead a little bit. Tell us about that California perspective. How do you look at how the regulations in California are evolving for crypto and payments?
Sure. Well, California was one of the rare states that decided to create its wholly own oversight through legislation of crypto. And they came out with what's called DFAL, or Digital Financial Assets Law, which is really a combination of two bills, and a third to be named in just a moment. The original two bills were Assembly Bill 39 and Senate Bill 401. So AB 39 was the licensing and oversight of crypto exchanging activities generally. And one other key element of that was legislation that regulates stablecoins. So California is the only state to date in the United States that through legislation has tackled stablecoins. So that's an interesting, chapter 6 of AB 39. The other bill, Senate Bill 401, was a bill that specifically targeted Bitcoin ATMs and their operations, instituting, among other things, a mandatory $1,000 per person per day transaction cap, a fee cap of 15%, and specific information that must be given to the consumer in the form of a disclosure and receipt at or around the time of transaction. So those two pieces of legislation were packaged together by our regulator out here in California, which is the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, or DFPI. So they packaged those together and they refer to them as DFAL. Now, this past session in California, we passed Assembly Bill 1934. Assembly Bill 1934 effectively moved the start time for implementation of AB 39, the licensing, until July 1st of 2026, whereas previously it was July 1st, 2025. And there are many reasons for that. I think the most obvious reason is the state of California is in a huge budget deficit, and they didn't have the funds to borrow from the general fund to get this project essentially off the ground, or to quote Chair Grayson, a Herculean lift to get this licensing regime built out, which DFPI is actively doing right now. So there's a lot of moving parts over there, a lot of rulemaking, a lot of engagement in industry so far. Candidly, I can tell you our interactions with the DFPI in California have been nothing but extremely positive. They're very much in listen and learn mode, reaching out to the industry. As a matter of fact, we had a summit in Sacramento last month where Brinley Lair, who leads the oversight of crypto at DFPI, was our keynote speaker and actively took questions and engaged with innovators and other folks in the marketplace, which is fantastic. So we've got a lot to do between now and July 1st of 2026, but I'm pleased to hear that the agency is not taking this lightly and is committed to learning from the mistakes of the rollout from the BIT license in New York, whereby they didn't have adequate staffing by their own account, didn't have adequate staffing, didn't have the funding in place and the mechanisms and the technology to intake applications, process them timely, and actively engage those who were waiting patiently in line.
Joe, a regulator that's interested in listening and learning, how novel an idea. Joe, let me stay with you for a minute.
Sure.
I do want to weave in the recent election, and you might have more up-to-date data, certainly for California, than I would. But are you concerned about any of the AB, I forgot the number, forgive me, moving forward, given some of the changes that you might have seen within California, or is that really not an issue?
What we're hearing in the next legislative session is it's unlikely that there's going to be any sort of bills targeting specifically crypto, although we work with our members all the time at CBAC and other folks, other stakeholders at the table, if there's ways that we can maybe engage the legislature to clean up legislation around some definitions or some technical things like that. That's quite possible. But we don't see anything necessarily retaliatory. If you're sort of insinuating, as I'm piecing through your question here, that maybe a pro-Trump regime in DC might lead to a response from California. California has announced, or the governor rather, in California has announced that he's convening an emergency session of the legislature to quote Trump-proof California. But we have not heard anything specific related to crypto or digital assets or anything along those lines. There are some other political issues which are beyond the scope of this conversation that the governor has itemized, but nothing appears to be related to or even tangentially related to crypto or digital payments.
Joe, thanks so much. Michelle, Joe said something that I think the three of us have said many times. There's a lot of moving parts. And every time you and I start talking about payments, I think there's a lot of moving parts times 50. How do you look at this landscape? And, candidly, how do you keep up? I mean, Joe, you've got California, which is busy enough. I'm sure you look at other states as well. Michelle, how do you keep up with all of the information that we see moving forward in the payments world?
So I think we're lucky to have the internet, and then it's doing your own data aggregation. And one thing about the states is you know the state website, and they generally put up alerts, and you can sign up for those alerts. There are some industry groups, but I think is particularly relevant to the people on this call. My view is that the information should be free. You shouldn't have to join a trade association and pay a large fee for access to information that is free. Certainly services like legal services, compliance services, lobbying services, yes. Information, no. And that's one of the reasons, Ron, we decided that we wanted to, do this on a quarterly basis. And I would encourage people, to talk to you potentially about membership or access to these webinars, because we will be speaking about what those updates are. And from a uniformity perspective, there is a model act, a model money transmitter act. It has been adopted by plus or minus 20 states, but of course, like everything else, some states haven't adopted the act in full. They've only adopted parts of it. There is a virtual currency provision of the act, which has widely not been adopted. I think that part has only been adopted by 2 or 3 states. So even though we're moving towards some uniformity, there are still some state nuances.
Michelle, thank you. Joe, I wanted to ask, I'm going to go off script again. Michelle will tell you I do that more frequently than I probably should. When I look at your lobbying efforts, Wall Street Blockchain Alliance, we are not lobbyists. We certainly know of lobbyists across different parts of the ecosystem. Let me ask, what made you decide at the state level lobbying was the best way to approach that? We've often seen others approach it from let's do the education of it. And we certainly see the importance of that. Why did you think lobbying was so important for the work you're doing in California?
Sure. Well, I think just to kind of reframe it a little bit, if I could, we are an
Please.
advocacy trade association, right? So part of that effort, and a large part of that effort, as you point out, rightfully so, is lobbying. Other aspects of that are education through, as I mentioned, the summit we hosted last month in Sacramento that brought together lawmakers, members of law enforcement, industry, and innovators to talk about what they're working on, talk about the importance of getting public policy right and what's regulation and how do we create guardrails that safeguard consumers, but also promote an innovation culture that we're known for here in California. So, but returning to your question about lobbying, it's really important in any state, and especially in California. So California is a little bit of an anomaly in many ways, but legislatively, it's an anomaly in that on average, I think something on the order of 700, 800, 900 bills are passed each year in California. So that's a very large amount. Yes, we are a large state, but it's disproportionately higher than other states when you account for population and number of businesses, number of impacted stakeholders, et cetera. So that lets us know that there is going to be a lot of legislation, and even if it's not crypto in the title or crypto even in the specific language, and I'm sure Michelle will tell you this from a legal perspective, there are certain references to different words that, if interpreted, could apply directly or indirectly to various different folks in the crypto space. So it's important for us to keep our eye on legislation and work with legislators. I'll add as well, in California, from the outside looking in, folks tend to think that we are this sort of, since we are a forward and innovative state, which we are, they tend to think that sort of somehow cascades its way into the legislature. And I can tell you it's not. It's not a bunch of sort of tech forward young people. In fact, we generally have an older demographic of lawmakers here, and they generally come from areas of politics already, or come from areas of labor or other aspects of the economy, lawyers that don't generally touch technology. So there is a little bit more of an education hurdle here that you might not necessarily think about when you look at sort of California on paper and think of Silicon Valley and innovation. So we have our work cut out for us in that regard. But yes, lobbying is one important tool and a tool that we utilize at CBAC, but it's also part of the equation. And the other part is, again, engaging in conversations with industry, bringing them together with law enforcement, working as we have in direct communication with the California Department of Financial Protection and Innovation, who's been very hospitable and very interested in getting to know not just our members, but getting to know more about the crypto community, all the innovations that are out there, and how best to thread that needle between consumer protection and innovation.
Yep. Joe, I appreciate that. Let me stay with you for a moment. Michelle, I'd love you to join. We talked about, you mentioned AB 39, I think it was SB 401 and AB 1934.
Correct, yes.
I've been studying. I want to unpack those a little bit, Joe, if we could. Can we plow into some of the details of those? And particularly, you and I chatted about how are some of the functions associated in those bills potentially models for other states. And I think the follow-on to that, making this a very big chunky question is, how does it differ from things like New York NYDFS's bit license? Can you unpack the legislation bills in California for us?
Well, the bit license went through by unelected bureaucrats. In California, the legislation went through the legislator, and whether and who you voted for is your own personal business, but these were elected officials that are accountable to the voters passing this legislation. So a little bit of a different sort of channel. How could it serve as a model? I think that was the basis of your question. So AB 39, again, sets up the crypto licensing and oversight in California. A few other states have done that, and we talked offline about this. Louisiana and apparently New Jersey is exploring something similar, among other states, right? Most states have sort of looked at this and said, well, we already have money transmission on the books in terms of regulation and legislation. Let's make a few adjustments to what we already have, as opposed to just sort of putting out sort of a soup to nuts regulatory oversight. So we're a little rare in that regard. I don't know if other states will go down that path. It's certainly something that I could see them entertaining, especially in a bull market where crypto is very popular and more folks are using it. It's pierced the mainstream. I do think of AB 39 that the point that I would hone in on as a potential for other states to adopt would be Chapter 6 that deals specifically with stablecoins. Because again, California is the only state that has tackled legislatively stablecoins, and now it's become such a popular. Well, for us in crypto, it's been popular for a while, but now it's become much more mainstream and popular as a rail to move funds and affect payments. That I think it can't be ignored, and two, to the degree it exists, state lawmakers are going to look for ways to regulate that or look to it and say, hey, yeah, this is crypto, but it's a little bit different, and I think that there may be some more ways that we would like to engage in terms of oversight, and maybe the regulators have gone to the lawmakers and said, hey, we need a few extra tools here that we can't necessarily work with what we have already. So I think that could potentially be something that the other states would look at California and say, well, okay, we know you put it inside of a bill that does licensing, but perhaps we in state B, state C, state D could look at this and say, hey, maybe we can create a stablecoin specific bill.
Joe, thanks so much. Michelle, hearing we already have money transmitter laws sounds suspiciously like we already have securities law and they should all apply. Michelle, Joe brought up stablecoins. It's an important part of the conversation. What are you seeing from the perspective of the payments dialogue across different states, that conversation about stablecoins? And for both of you, one of the concerns for a long time and let's just talk about Tether. When you see the size and scope of Tether and some of the concerns that legislators across the federal and state have raised. Michelle, what are you seeing in the stablecoin landscape, and how are payments laws affected by that?
We're seeing a lot of interest, a lot of increased interest in entities potentially becoming licensed. We're definitely seeing more interest and engagement by the regulators themselves. I was invited a couple of months ago to do a teaching session on crypto, which included stablecoins, to a bunch of the money transmitter regulators in the Southwest. So it was prompted by Texas, but Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and the regulators were very interested in hearing the use cases. I think there's a number of reasons why the states are interested in regulating. First of all, it's money for them. When you're licensed, you are paying application fees, you're paying renewals fees, you're paying state taxes. And so it's revenue generating for the state. And in most states, and I won't say all states, the states want that revenue, and they don't want to make it particularly difficult for you to be licensed. They are going to examine you. I think New York DFS is maybe an outlier with respect to the licensing regime and the speed of licensing. And I think a lot of companies are saying, I'm okay not having a New York license. I'm okay with blocking US users. But the regulators understand, I think most fundamentally, the flow of funds. because they are used to seeing payments. And so you're not going to a regulator who doesn't understand necessarily the theory behind the transaction. And I've interacted with many states and have been so pleasantly surprised that when you send them the flow of funds, even that involves crypto and complicated crypto transactions, they either understand it or, more fundamentally, they want to understand it. And if you have regulators who want to understand it because they want to encourage business in their state and not stifle business, that's a really good place to be, in my opinion.
Michelle, thanks. Joe, I want, if you could, like in response to Michelle's comments, you know, wanting to enable innovation, and you've talked about California really being an innovative state from the perspective of technology and so on. How do you respond to legislators that might say, well, yeah, we're pro-innovation, but what about consumer protections? What about AML KYC? What about some of the things that for a long time have been popular, you know, whipping horses for anti-crypto folks? Again, I'm getting a little off the script, Joe, but how do you respond in that capacity in what you do in California, or has that begun to fade away?
It unfortunately has not faded away. Our conversations last legislative session with California lawmakers, there were some that were just convinced that crypto is another form of gambling, or, you know, why would anyone, you know, buy cryptocurrency? It has no use case, or the only people I would see using this particular business model would be money launderers. And it was insulting at first, but you have to understand that they're headline reading, right? They're not getting into the nitty-gritty of the industry. They don't have the benefit that all of us here have in serving in this industry in some capacity for years, enriching ourselves with information and meeting folks and seeing different business models and flow of funds diagram and talking to the innovators and really immersing ourselves, not just in the technical aspects, but in the culture and understanding what folks are working on. And again, these are generalists. Elected officials are generalists. They're expected to learn everything, again, from fire safety and infrastructure and education and healthcare and housing. And we're expecting them to learn a brand new language, frankly, in cryptocurrency. So it's not going to stop. There's going to be an education effort that's going to have to continue. There are some folks that are set in their ways on this, and it can be very difficult to sometimes have a cogent conversation and offer a counter proposal in terms of, well, I see what you're saying about this particular control about a transaction cap, but we don't think that would be effective. How about instead, we could have something on the order of stronger disclosures or a first-time contact with a customer or something alternative. And it's about having those conversations and saying, hey, we think that this could be more practical. We're not saying we don't want to regulate it. We don't say we want safety. We want to protect consumers as you do as an elected official with your constituents, but we think there might be a better way to do it. And having those types of conversations, and that goes back to your original question about engagement and folks that are building out their government relations and government affairs groups. It's about having conversations. It's not about wanting anything special or extra treatment. It's about level setting and saying, hey, this is a way we can practically achieve the balance of protecting consumers and promoting innovation, two concepts that I believe are not mutually exclusive.
Joe, thank you for that. Let me push back a little bit on one thing you mentioned there. Michelle, please tell me if you agree or disagree. And I absolutely get where you're going, Joe. We at the WSBA have had many of these conversations, and you're right. They are generalists. I hesitate to use politicians. I drop that word a lot like a bad word, but they're generalists. They're not going to be focused. But I will push back because we've had a lot of conversations with staffers at many levels, many of whom more deeply understand. Let me ask this question. I don't mean this to be a not-for-profit kind of lobbyist conversation particularly, but what are the benefits of having those conversations with staffers, and how much does the staff who might understand the technology, how much does that influence what legislators look at?
Oh, it could be a huge influence. First of all, staffers set calendars, and they kind of know where people are on the map and where things are moving around under the dome, so to speak. So getting a good solid relationship and engagement with staffers is key. And it does help out. We've spoken with staffers that understand crypto and can hold a very high level advanced or conversation about cryptocurrency. But unfortunately, if their boss is not in favor of cryptocurrency, they have to put that hat back on. And they'll be happy to talk, about crypto and what's going on in this space and debate different, philosophies and where we're going as an industry. But once their boss enters the fray with a particular position, they are duty bound to operate in that best interest, which we understand. So, but yeah, back to your initial question, it's really important to have those conversations with the staffers, and sometimes they can help achieve at least a stronger communication about alternative ideas, as I mentioned before, right? Okay, if we want to have some sort of consumer guardrails in place, maybe the guardrails that are proposed are a little onerous or don't quite fit a particular business model, but perhaps there's an alternative of equal or even greater value that they weren't necessarily thinking about that we can communicate, but communicate through that Rosetta Stone of a staffer who has a little bit more understanding of crypto, is maybe a little bit more in touch with that technology, whether they're using it themselves or have a network of folks or someone in their network, I should say, that is involved in the space and maybe can help them better understand that.
Michelle, I have never had a staffer who's confessed to me whether or not they do or don't own crypto. But to Joe's point, are you having similar conversations?
I generally don't ask if and I'm talking, I don't really do policy work in the same way that Joe does. I will advocate to a regulator for a change in the drafting of law, but I'm not interacting with the staffers in that way. So, but with respect to the regulators, they are hearing the good and the bad. A lot of the state regulators are focused on elder fraud and elder abuse, particularly with crypto. And so leaning in, when the ecosystem leans in and says, well, of course we don't want elder fraud and elder abuse in everyday crypto transactions, I find them to be very, very, very hospitable about, okay, can you give us can you project anonymously or non-anonymously, can you give us some information that could potentially help us stop some of this fraud? Not information like responding to a subpoena, but just what questions on the business side are you seeing to help the regulators?
Right. Michelle, thanks so much. Joe, I wanted to, and by the way, for everyone in the audience, again, thank you so much for being here. We do see some of the questions queuing up. If you've got questions, queue them up for us, and Joe and Michelle and I will review them towards the end. Joe, you said something interesting. I'm going to paraphrase it a bit earlier. Unelected bureaucrats, I think was the phrase, and we hear that phrase nationwide across different industry conversations that we have. But it raises an interesting point. I want to go back to the Assembly and Senate rules that you're talking about being passed there. That process itself, is it, if I recall correctly, it's still open for public feedback? Is that correct?
Yeah, so, well, there's public feedback on rulemaking, right? So the laws have been signed by the governor, they've been passed. Certainly things can be repealed through legislation, but short of that, rare circumstance, right now it's moving into the rulemaking aspect, which is just basically that, right? The regulators now have the legislation, they have the law that's signed, they interpret it, and they have to make rules based on what's in that legislation. And there are certain, important rules that are in there, and certain affirmative statements about what needs to be required of a licensee, for example, or a hard and fast rule like a transaction cap. But there are other aspects that are open to interpretation. If there's a requirement around, let's say, a surety bond, but there's no specifics about what that covers or what amount, that particular aspect, as my example, would fall to the regulator to put in rulemaking. And then the rulemaking becomes part of public comment. And DFPI, again, tip my hat to them, has been very engaging with the industry. Right now, there is a public comment period. I believe it's the second one to date. This particular one expires on the 18th, which I believe is next Monday, November 18th, for the current period. So it's about 20 pages PDF of information on there. Again, everything from how much should we charge for a license application to what's in a surety bond, how should records be submitted, and other aspects of what is required. And these are the technical nuances. And this is where I think folks can really have a great impact by submitting public comment. If you think your voice doesn't matter, trust me, it's completely the opposite. Make your voice heard, whether it's through organizations like us, where we can speak on behalf of various different entities, or it's coming straight from your own office. Make your voice heard, because there are technical nuances in there. We're dealing with human beings. Human beings are imperfect. Sometimes things could be misinterpreted, or a particular requirement could be something that's frankly, technologically infeasible, right? So you want to be able to have that opportunity and have your voice and engage and use these public forums, in this case, public comment, to opine and contribute your thought leadership.
Joe, thanks so much. And one of the things we talked about in prep, and I want to stay with you for a moment, the build out of what you're seeing in California between now and I think it's June or July of 2020. How do you see that build out working for the industry?
So far, so good. I think the industry is kind of in a wait and see mode. If I have one more person ask me where the application is for a California license, I don't know what I might do at that point. It's in process. But the conversations we've had with Brinley and her team at DFPI, again, have been really constructive. She's walking us down the path of where they are in terms of construction, right? They're building this license oversight and regulatory regime seemingly from scratch. Yes, they have a lot of resources and smart folks already in their office, but they have to create the process of intake. What's the form going to look like? How is it going to be submitted? How are we going to engage folks throughout the process? And a lot of conversations have focused on being transparent with applicants. What information do we need ahead of time? Or do you need to cure, to use their words, the things you need to cure before you actively are considered for a license? And to those that are already in the license queue at that point, how do we let them know that we're still looking at their application and we're still keeping contact? There another dig at New York with the bit license. Months go by, years go by, and there's no contact. They're unfortunate. Unfortunately, that's happened, but fortunately, we can learn from that in California. And a lot of the emphasis I see is on having the proper technology, the proper infrastructure to intake, review, and adequately decision and license folks, but also just as important, if not even more important, from what we hear, is giving transparency to applicants throughout the process. And I think that benefits not just applicants in the industry, but I think that benefits consumers. Consumers want to see choice. They want to see different options and different participants, and they want to know that if someone's applying for a license and going to the state of California, that they're given a fair shake, and they're given an opportunity to engage with the state and say, hey, we want to serve Californians. Here's what we have to offer. Let's work out something that makes sure it's safe for consumers and promotes innovation and quite frankly, can propel the space forward.
Joe, thanks so much. Michelle, I don't know if you caught that, but it feels like Joe set up a West Coast versus East Coast kind of conversation that we'll have to pick up. Michelle, and I know you focus on clients that have business in a multitude of states. What are the biggest questions your clients, just following on from Joe's comments, what are the biggest questions your clients have about DFAL in California?
Mainly when it's going to come into effect. I think a lot of companies, thought July 2025. Now we're being pushed to July 2026. A lot of companies are asking, will I need both a virtual currency license and a money transmitter license? Or if I have the virtual currency license, does that mean I don't need the money transmitter license? I think a lot of clients are also interested, if I only deal in NFTs or I'm crypto only. And these are the types of questions that I think, you really need to have. A lot of these questions are legal questions. In my view, compliance is implementing the legal advice. And so it's really important to understand from a legal perspective, do you need to comply with the law? And then if so, how do you comply with the law? And one thing I also wanted to piggyback on what Joe said, which was application processing. The states don't have good infrastructure. They don't have good technology. That's a given. Okay. Some states process applications faster than others. Your Michigans, your Missouris, your New Hampshires, your Arizonas, they generally process applications faster than other states. New York, it could take you, 18 months to 2 years, even for a basic money transmitter license. What's important is your application forms have to be complete and they have to be accurate, because if the form that you're submitting is wrong, it's going to get bounced. And then states have an incredible number of requirements for policies and procedures and business plans and flow of funds. And those need to be really thoughtful, and they need to meet the state requirements. And so, it's a balance between being able to get the applications done quickly, but also making sure that you are not causing your own delay by not giving the regulator what they want and what they need to license you quickly.
Michelle, thanks. I want to go back to something you mentioned. You mentioned NFTs, and I know in prep we had a conversation. And this might be me speaking out of ignorance, so forgive me. But when you talk to clients, the digital goods issue, what are we talking about when you have clients raise that digital goods issue? Are we talking about NFTs? How do you explain that to clients?
There's a law, AB 2426, that is another California consumer protection bill, and it requires certain protections for consumers, and I think anyone in the digital goods NFT space who wants to do business in California with California customers. And remember, California also technically requires a license for advertising money transmission. A lot of people don't realize that the mere advertising, do they enforce that? Do they go after companies that are only advertising without a license? I have not personally seen it, but if you read the statute, it's pretty clear. So I think if you are doing business or want to do business in California, you should be thinking about what laws apply to you.
Michelle, thanks. Joe, to Michelle's earlier comment, when California gets hit with this wave of applications, they'll be able to process them much more quickly than New York, I'm wagering you'll say?
I think that's what they're banking on. I certainly hope that that's the case. It's unfortunate that the circumstances that have happened with the bit license historically, but again, we can turn that into a positive by saying it's a lesson to be learned. A lot of folks may not know this, but during the legislative process in California, while they were working on AB 39, Chair Grayson's office and some other delegates from California flew out and met with folks at the NYDFS and basically said, hey, what did you get right? What did you get wrong? If you could do it all over again, if you had a magic wand. And they did some information gathering and said, hey, how could we do this better? And so knowing as they did, hey, if we're going to open ourselves up as a large market, New York's obviously a large state, California is even larger, we're going to be inundated with applications. How do we handle this? And the immediate feedback was, well, we didn't hire enough people, which is accurate, but I think that's maybe part of the answer and maybe not the full answer.
Right.
But I think building out adequate systems, Michelle rightly pointed out that states have limited technology. There's only so much they can do with what they have in vendor systems. Brinley fully acknowledged that in my conversation here in California, but they said they can work with what they have and create an environment that where they can control the things they can control. So for example, in California, they want to look at a license application once it is fully complete, meaning they're going to have two steps. The first step is load all your information, get everything set up, complete the application. They'll review that strictly for completeness, not for veracity, not for technical nuance, but have you dotted all your I's, crossed all your T's. And at that point, it will go into decisioning to prevent what was sort of alluded to earlier, where there's a back and forth and, hey, you didn't complete Form 3, you completed Form 4, D only, and there's a lot of back and forth. Let's get it to a point where everything is all done. Then it moves on, and then it goes into the decisioning phase, which I think is a strong part of it. The other big part of it is the DFPI over a 3-year period has submitted a budget to hire 100 people strictly for crypto, not anything else, not securities, not check writing, money transmission in the traditional sense, but strictly in crypto. They want to hire 100 folks, and they want, I believe, something on the order of 30 million over a 3-year period to do that. Right. So that's a lot of money and that's a lot of people. And so will they get it all? I don't know. You can ask for anything you want in a budget. But ultimately, it shows the level that they are willing to go to and what they believe they need to do in order to have a system that works, not just for the applicant, but works for the consumer and works for the marketplace.
Joe, thanks so much. For the record, this conversation is the sole excuse I've got for flying out to California for a vacation. So stay tuned. Michelle, I want to come to you. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Obviously you look at other states, and you and I have had this conversation before. What other states should we be, we'll have the conversation in future episodes. What other states should we keep an eye out for immediately? New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania comes to mind. And let's, add to that from a favorability of payments and crypto perspective. Wyoming's not that only game in town either. What are you looking at?
I think from a legislative point of view, we want to keep a look at New Jersey. New Jersey, a number of times has put forth a bit license type legislation. It hasn't gotten passed, but it wouldn't surprise me if we see something like that soon. Louisiana and even Texas, have components of their statutes. Keeping a watch on Pennsylvania. They recently sought to amend their Money Transmitter Act, and some of the language in the amended statute was causing some concern that it could encompass unhosted wallet providers to needing a license. And so some clients and customers of ours, as well as some trade associations, got together and wrote a letter, explaining why the legislation should be amended so that it doesn't capture unhosted wallet providers. I think also keeping an eye on states that are friendly. I refer to Texas a lot. I've had very, very good and strong conversations with the regulators there. It has always been a very pro-business state. It is not afraid of crypto. It has pretty good staffing in terms of the Department of Banking. They are a little bit faster than your average state, but they want the business. And so, yes, you have your Wyomings that are crypto friendly, but you can also look at states that are just generally business friendly. They don't necessarily have to be crypto friendly. They just can't be anti-crypto.
Michelle, let me stay with you for a moment. And Joe, I'd love you to weigh in, pardon me, on this as well. Michelle, you and I have had this conversation in the past also, which is we've seen startups or companies that start and they'll walk through the doors at your office and say, we need money transmitter licenses in all 50 states. And I think our initial response to those comments are you sure you'd need that? How do you respond? How do you suggest companies approach licensing in the US? Michelle, I'd love to hear your opinion on that. Joe, certainly give us your perspectives on that as well.
So, I think capitalism is a great thing. And I think when service providers hear 50 states, they see dollar signs. But it's not a matter of whether it generates a lot of business for the service provider. It's what does your business need? And so what I say to prospective clients is that's great that you want 50 state coverage. Let's talk about the time and expense to get 50 state coverage, because it is incredibly possible. But do you have customers in all 50 states? Or might, whatever your budget is, might we want to look at really where you have a higher concentration of customers and start with those states, knowing that you'd have to block customers in the other states where you don't have a license. And also, some states have lower requirements, lower net worth requirements. Some states don't require as many policies and procedures. Some states, the surety bond requirement is lower. And so there are ways to get, a good number of state licenses, even if you don't necessarily have the resources to do 50 states. So I think I've always operated from a place of if you start always with the customer in mind and you keep the customer in mind and they can afford to get 3, 4, 5, 10 licenses, they're going to stick with you when they're ready to get the 50. Or maybe they decide, I don't really need to be in Alaska because there's not a lot of people in Alaska using my application.
Right. Michelle, Joe, do you want to weigh in on that, please?
No, I agree with what Michelle said. I would echo those sentiments. I think in the early days of crypto, listen to me, the early days of crypto, it was sort of a search.
Old timers now, Joe.
Right. Yeah, I'm getting old. No, there was a search for the so-called no action state. I don't particularly care for that term, but in the vernacular of the crypto space, meaning a state that would give you a determination and you wouldn't necessarily have to get a license based on your unique facts and circumstances. Mm-hmm. Well, there used to be a lot of so-called no action states. Back when I started in 2015 and even several years thereafter, but as more and more are going to what we maybe classify as full license in some form or capacity, we don't necessarily have that benefit. So it's sort of like, well, California and Montana for now, and then sort of the other states are as Michelle alluded to, sort of various different levels of difficulty in terms of not just the application and the timing, but the requirements, right? Some states might want financials, other states might want audited financials, which means a higher cost is incurred. So I'm of the belief it should start, you should start small and then grow with your customers in mind, perfectly said by Michelle. We've had a lot more clients that approach us at BidAML and say, hey, look, I just want to start in states X, Y, and Z, prove my model, ring the register, so to speak, get some customers in here, get a good vibe, get my branding out there, and then take those funds and engage in the states where maybe the barriers to entry are a little bit more difficult, or the licensing takes a little bit longer, because I'll have the time, the stomach, and the opportunity to engage in those while I grow my business and show the marketplace that I have something to offer. And then I've proven that I can be successful in states A and B. Now I'm ready to show states C and D that I can serve their constituents.
Joe, Michelle, thank you both so much. I realize, like all good webinars, we've only got about 4 or 5 minutes left. And I'm looking at my notes, Michelle. There's a bunch of stuff I didn't bring up, including a slide I think you wanted me to show.
Oh, that's okay. But I know we have a couple of questions.
Yes.
So I did want to be respectful of the audience members.
Yeah. Do you want to, let's do it. Raphael has a question, considering that we're on the topic of money transmitter licensing. Michelle, would you say the agent of the payee exemption might extend to digital assets in states that recognize this exemption, depending on how each state defines payment? Do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think the agent of the payee exemption exists federally, and some but not all states recognize it. I think, again, to my earlier point, I think some of these questions are legal determinations. And to avail yourself of the agent of the payee exemption, you have to have certain requirements. And I think that I have seen that exemption used successfully in certain states in crypto business models. But again, it's very case by case basis.
Michelle, thanks. Raphael, thanks for the question. Gabrielle weighed in. Joe, I'd love you to take this question. I think you've already noted that. Is there a reason why money transmitter laws need to be at the state level? Is there any concern? Is there a concern that lack of uniformity may restrain the normalization of crypto? Joe, do you want to weigh in on this question?
Sure, I think that there's definitely some concerns about the ability to scale an enterprise in the United States when you have to get a license in virtually every state and territory. Michelle sort of covered the history earlier on, where this sort of started with check cashing and traditional money remittance services being regulated at the state level. Yes, there's a revenue component to it, for the states, but also where money transmission comes in at the state level, the states focus on consumer protection. Whereas at the federal level, FinCEN focuses on protecting the integrity of the financial system, protecting it from organized illicit actors. And so there's sort of two just general different lenses. And when consumer protection comes into the fray, different states, laboratories of democracy, have different interpretations, different value systems, and different beliefs when it comes to what is the level of oversight of consumers. And sometimes that takes the form of hard and fast rules like transaction caps and fee caps. And in other states, it is a little bit more open for the marketplace, and those in the marketplace to discover the services they want. So, yeah, I definitely think it holds us back. There are some estimates out there that are in the several hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars if you want to get all state licenses. I don't think that that's the best way to look at it. As Michelle kindly refocused us on, let's put the customer first. Let's work on the states where we're providing services, where we're serving our customers, where we want to grow. And then before you know it, we'll start growing out to other states. So there are challenges that come along with that. From a country specific perspective, right? We don't have to deal with states if you're in most other countries. It's a unique factor to the US all its own. And along with that come those challenges.
Joe, thanks so much. I want to get to this last question. Michelle, I'd love you to take a crack at it. I think it's a really fascinating question. Do you expect advisors who provide advisory services in virtual currencies to be brought into the licensing requirements in any shape or form? That's a really interesting question, Michelle.
Yeah, again, I think you have to go back to the definition of money transmission in each state, which generally requires the receipt of funds and the transmission of those funds. So I think if you're just an advisor and you fall within that scope, you might be. And if you're an advisor and you don't fall within that scope, but again, these are likely legal questions.
Michelle, Joe, thank you both so much. Last few moments, Michelle, we'll be doing this again. Joe, you'll be stuck chatting with us in the future. Michelle, where do people keep up with you and find out the things that you're doing, or if they have additional questions?
Yeah, you can reach me at michelle@changeagents.co. I can also drop that in the chat. But yeah, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm on Telegram, I'm on Signal, I'm on X or Twitter, like everybody else.
Michelle, thanks so much. Joe, how do people find out what you're doing, keep in touch, and reach out to BitAML?
Yeah, sure. Real quick, my email address is joe@bitaml.com. You can check us out at bitaml.com. We have a blog section. We post quite regularly on blogs, and we have a twice weekly newsletter where we keep folks caught up on the latest goings on in terms of regulatory compliance, not just at the state level, but federally, and policy and all that. And some fun stuff is mixed in there as well. So it's a great way to stay on top of what's going on there. I too will put my email address in the chat, so if folks want to copy that. But yeah, again, joe@bitaml.com. Happy to talk about crypto compliance and, of course, all things California regulatory goings on.
Michelle, Joe, thank you both so much. Really enjoyed the conversation. There'll be future conversations as well. For everyone in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. If you've got questions for our panelists or the WSBA, info@wsba.co. We will leave it there. See you all next time. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.